So thank you so much once again, Claire Walker, joining us from United Kingdom. Your introduction doesn't need a mention, but since like you've been working in voice program and a lot of human trafficking work and research work and human rights promotion, domestic violence, you've been working on all. So this is what you've been. So I'm going to start with my first uh, question, which is certainly an important question. Says like provide a concise overview of the voice program.
I would say the most concise way to describe the voice program is the acronym of the voice stands for Victims of Intimate Coerced Experience. So that's who the program is aimed at predominantly. So it's for victims, regardless of their identity groups, their gender, sexuality, or any of those things. So it's for all victims. And it looks at domestic abuse through a trauma-informed lens, and in doing so and explaining how a trauma response can manifest in the moment and as well after that point, a victim can better understand their own reactions and responses, as can professionals who attend for training purposes and use the model in their services. So it's looking at people through an intersectional lens as well, and it gives a psycho-educational walk through what it is to be a victim of domestic abuse and how that manifests so that we can understand trauma much better. I think it's most succinct I can get it.
Once again, ma'am, briefing us, giving us an overview of voice program. It is important to know different programs working on human trafficking, human rights, domestic violence, and their philosophy and theoretical orientations in order to build a scientific database, have a clarity and scientific temperament also about various kind of social pathologies. Thanks a lot. It's a good brief up. So as you know, like RESO is a platform, like we've been sort of, working. Our main intention is to step through the noise to cause you most reliable sociological explanations and narrations on various societal topics. So that's the reason we are on board today. So would like to move on to my second question. It says like clearly articulate your understanding of domestic violence. Is it limited to one gender?
Okay. So the second part of that question regarding gender can head off straight away in terms of what I've just explained with the voice. It's an intersectional lens. So yes, absolutely. How that actually manifests in real time is quite conflicting and confusing unless we're looking at the specific issues and not just behaviours that are presented out of context. So domestic abuse, it is absolutely insidious. It's probably one of the more long-standing things that has been present in our global communities through history. So it is, a lot of it is just from human behaviour. And so that's what we need to look at the issue of is human behaviour and action, reaction, cause and effect, because this model of practice that is used by a person who wishes to exert power over another person, then the behaviours are all the same, whether it's in a domestic abuse, whether it's in a trafficking situation or further exploitation, it's always the same behaviours, and that is based in coercive control. And there lies the nuances, because all of our systems look at domestic abuse in terms of the violence, and that doesn't improve anything for anybody, as is demonstrated by the stats. So we look at a person's behaviour and a person's action and reaction. So when we're focusing on intimate relationships or familial relationships, and we're looking at that interplay of behaviours, then there's lots of similarities. In an intimate relationship, right from the beginning, the person who wants to exert power and control to whatever level is already coming from that standpoint. The perpetrators get to learn and understand more information about their potential victim, and they are then able to use that and see where their weaknesses might be in terms of something that they've shared. So a victim in that honeymoon period at the early stage of the relationship might, by getting to know each other, might discuss about, I don't know, lost a parent the year before, and they've been struggling with that grieving. So the perpetrator can use that to emotionally, coercively control the victim at any point, or use that in terms of undermining the victim's mental stability because of the impact of the grief. So they turn it back around and reframe the victim's reality. So in this honeymoon period, it's actually a grooming period when one person in the two has an intention other than just to have an intimate relationship with the other person. So the honeymoon period in a healthy relationship, that's all perfect and fine. If either party says or does anything that doesn't sit comfortably or upsets or anything in any way, those two people in a healthy relationship, even at that early stage, they can have a discussion and navigate around that, or in that early stage, they can decide to part. That isn't an option when we're talking about a perpetrator grooming their next victim. And it is only the victim, the potential victims, who are able to walk away, say, I'm not interested, separate themselves successfully from that potential perpetrator. That is when that relationship could end. If this perpetrator is, so I don't like to use a scale, but say a high level, as in an intense, all surrounding perpetrator, then they're not necessarily going to accept the ending of a relationship, even in that early grooming period. It depends on where their intention is set. And their intentions are set from their core beliefs. And our core beliefs are formulated in our formative years from all of the messages around us. Our brains at that stage have got lots more development to do, and therefore how we translate that information in those 0 to 5 years is not as analytical as it would be for someone who's in our age ranges, or 20 and above or something. So those core beliefs are then what informs a person's behaviors. It's the motivation behind all and everything we do as the human condition. So this isn't something that we can plan or choose to do. If we become aware our core beliefs are causing harm or distress, we can work on ourselves to change and amend those core beliefs and therefore the behaviors. If a person doesn't wish to do that, then those behaviors will never change. And I guess it's the same for the victim on the receiving end, in terms of a victim needs to get to a point of feeling that they value themselves more than anything else, and therefore they have a right to be free and at liberty in their relationships. So the three things that is always present in a domestic abuse relationship is there needs to be rules that are implemented overtly or covertly by a perpetrator. There are consequences for those rules not being adhered to, and these rules could have never been expressed more often than not, and the victim is unaware that they've done anything wrong in the first place, which increases the trauma impact that victim will experience because it's more of a shock. And ultimately, the victim will feel fear. So when we speak to victims and we ask them if they feel fear, because society-wide we have an understanding that fear is induced by someone being mad, bad, angry, or dangerous in front of us. When it's our intimate partner, or a family member, if it's a familial abuse situation, then we kind of ignore our physiological responses and we have that feeling. So a person might have, feel a bit nauseous, or they might feel a bit tightness in their chest and things like that. They don't understand why it's there because they're in their own home and they're with their intimate partner. So why are they feeling that? So they suppress that feeling and react to what they think they're dealing with. And therefore, when we just say without a full explanation or clarity, when we say to a victim, do you feel fear? The majority of victims will say no, because the majority of victims don't experience significant acts of violence or frequent significant acts of violence. Therefore, their fear levels are reduced. And there was some research from Evan Starr, and the figures off the top of my head, it was for a victim experiencing non-violence in a domestic abuse situation. Their consistent levels of fear of imminent threat or death and rape is 80% of the time. And for somebody who is receiving significant and frequent acts of violence on the other extreme, a strange parallel, then their levels of fear are about 18%, because they know what's going to happen. They know what their perpetrator does. There's not that psychological manipulation as much. Obviously, it's still there, but the victims feel more able to manage that situation.
Thanks a lot for updating and giving altogether a different narration and kind of, more empirical data, which I figure out a sense of indulging, taking the fresh experience into a narration, and the context differs. But the problem, domestic violence, does happen like domestic when we talk domestic violence, it's existing here in our context as well as existing in developed context also. The context may differ, but the problem doesn't differ. It is
No.
still there. So it's important to sort of, see your narration and your explanations. I'm sure it's going to help to a great extent to our audience while watching your narration and giving explanation. So would like to move on to my third question. Important question says identify the actions currently being undertaken to effectively prevent domestic violence.
There are many actions. There's different countries that have put into their domestic legislation pieces of legislation, obviously, to help prevent or to create a consequence where something is more crimed. So the coercive control being legislated for in various countries, not enough, and by no means all. However, some of those countries that's sort of applauded to at least have it there. It doesn't mean to say that their practices on the ground will be any different. However, when you're trying to demonstrate and evidence what is actually going on in a situation, if you have legislation to refer to, it's a starting point for the discussion in whatever arena that discussion's happening, whether it's court or professionals or research, really. And as you said before, you asked this question, it is the world over. It isn't anything to do with any type of peoples other than peoples. We're just peoples, and we all share these abilities and capacities to behave these ways wherever we live in the world. Part of the issue is that globally, we have a framework of reference which is based in patriarchy, and that is underpinned by misogyny, and that is present in every country the world over. So everybody is sort of signed up to that framework of how to view and react and respond to the world. So the significant levels of females who are maimed and murdered through male violence specifically, that is significantly higher because it is supported by a patriarchal system. So the systemic changes are ultimately what needs to move and progress towards a more balanced and equality-based framework of societies. I don't know that's going to happen in my lifetime, let alone yours. However, that would have shifts in terms of dealing with education, dealing with consequence, dealing with death toll, dealing with health impacts, because the health impacts go throughout a victim's life, they don't stop. And in terms of addressing and dealing with these issues, Francis Bacon back in the 1600s, there's quotes of him pointing out that we need to basically stop focusing on violence and start looking at the non-violence in terms of impacts and harms caused. So, over 400 years ago, somebody had already identified this issue. And so globally, we haven't really moved on far in 400 years based on that as a starting point, and who knows what was recorded or noted anywhere before then. And then when we go bring it up to date to Evan Stark's quote in his lectures in 2020 and his research, he says that if we're looking for acts of violence, we will continue to overlook the 97% of harms already endured, which is pretty much reflective of what Francis Bacon said 400 years before. So in the UK, we have the legislation, which is starting, the Domestic Abuse Act 2021, sorry, to be specific, which is starting to trickle down in terms of a cause and effect of agencies and society's understanding beginning to change, beginning to realise that a violence framework of reference is not going to significantly impact this issue. We need a violent framework of reference for a multitude of different behaviours and criminalities, but this isn't one. It doesn't capture it, and therefore it's not really useful. So, as I said at the top of responding to this question, ultimately we need an equal framework for our societies to sit within. And UK government in closed meetings have already shared with colleagues that a move away from patriarchy to equality isn't going to happen for a multitude of different reasons that they felt was a reasonable rationale in that discussion. And so systemically, these aren't going to change. As far as I'm aware, here in the UK, it'd be nice to say anywhere else. However, I would doubt it very much. It just, the starting point is that's a lot to change. So that suggests that people potentially collectively, globally, aren't interested enough to deal with this issue other than talk about it and highlight it and say this is awful, what shall we do?
This large body of quantitative and qualitative data you've shared with us, you've also referred like a frank admission on global framework of patriotism, whereas like it's certainly a problem because it's not just developing nations problem, it's like a problem in developed nations as well. It's like that's what you like your words you've mentioned, like global problem patriotism, like
it does, and that the sort of gender stereotypes that when you've got a male victim in that context of that patriarchal context as well, then I wouldn't say it's any worse or better for anybody. However, it does incur a different level of psychological not understanding, and that can impact on how a male victim feels about themselves, what that means about their masculinity, and I don't mean in any toxic way, just being male, which everybody should be allowed to do, obviously. So it doesn't help it doesn't help males or females.
Lord, you've also mentioned the theoretical and historical base, like you mentioned Francis Bacon, his work, like important on when he talked about domestic, not exactly domestic violence, but a kind of violence which certainly can impact our society, cause disparity and imbalance. So that's what I figured out. So thanks a lot for briefing us up on this important question. So would like to move on to my fourth question. Very important question, ma'am. Says explain the concept of diversity and discrimination in the context of human rights.
Well, in the context of human rights, victims' human rights, whether they're adult or child, are breached on a daily basis by definition. And so if we look at it from that perspective, and then we look at an individual's identity and the groups that they might self-identify with, then that helps us see how their human rights would be blocked, breached, additionally. So I like to use the intersectional research as this basically, in the most simplest of terms, it helps paint a picture of how many different barriers and challenges a person may have on the basis of what they identify themselves as being. And then look at that in the context of being a victim, and then we can see why there would be a further increase of their human rights being breached. So to give some examples, if that's helpful, if we're from a LGBTQ plus community, then the starting point of barriers there is that they've got to access a heteronormative framework. Research for years and years has demonstrated that the LGBT plus don't access the heteronormative framework, and definitely not for protection, because it isn't provided because of people's understandings and misunderstandings, etc., etc., and clumsy use of language, as is quite frequently the case. And a person from an LGBTQ context, where they draw their power frameworks from, because it's not necessarily going to be on a man and a woman in a heterosexual framework, obviously by definition. And so those power frameworks are drawn from the social norms of that community. And like any community, there's plethora of layers and layers and layers of communities within a community. And if we think also about if we are of colour or minority, or I've got a language barrier, or my faith practice, my culture practice, whatever it is that I identify in terms of that ethnicity spectrum of identity, that adds more layers again in terms of where I live. If I live in a part of the world where I've always lived, then I've got a little bit less barrier. If I am in a country on a spouse visa, then my barriers are significantly increased because I am reliant on my husband or wife. So there are multiples of different barriers depending on the identity and the context for a victim in those arenas. Language is always an issue, because if I don't have the language of where the services are, or even just my neighbours where I live, then that's a significant barrier in terms of people feeling they can get any kind of support. So therefore they remain more silent for longer. And also for victims who have perpetrator who identifies as black, and to a degree also our brown and ethnic minority groups, then the consideration from in those identity groups being disproportionately processed and convicted, if that's the way it goes, in terms of incarceration or any legal process that's happening prior to that point. So a victim will take that into consideration as well, and they don't want to sort of participate and reinforce colonial stereotypes, etc., etc. And these all cause barriers because it stops the victim from feeling able. And to be honest, a lot of people I have worked with over the years that are not white British, the amount of times that the work I have been doing is to explain, this is your faith, this is your culture, this is a crime, and to sort of extrapolate those is huge. And then if we think of somebody who is an older person, our services are intrinsically ageist because we don't really have a provision for someone who is older. We're getting better at it in some parts of the world. However, it's not a foregone known aspect that a victim in a 65 plus age group can access support and help and then be able to be heard, believed, understood, on top of all of those fear of not being heard, believed, or understood that a victim has anyway. So the intersectional aspect just layers up incremental barriers that will keep a victim more vulnerable and silent.
Important to learn your perceptions, like power frameworks are also very important, and their layers in a given society, which actually can control the power structure in the normal, not exactly normal, but the entire behavior of a community, how to sort of have access on your human rights and how to sort of go for when there is a discrimination and a kind of violence against human rights. That's what I figure out. So once again, a good feedback. Would like to move on to my fifth question. One question says, define what a responsible society looks like in terms of promoting human rights.
I guess any society which actually has human rights legislation is a good starting point. How those human rights legislations are ratified within any domestic country legislation is down to that country's decision makers. So some parts of the articles or whole articles may be ratified and others not. So a full, robust human rights legislation in place and fully ratified and understood and referenced in practices. And if we started by looking at domestic abuse as we have a human rights breach here, if we started the viewing there rather than this victim just keeps not engaging, or they're always saying that, or this perpetrator needs to do some physical assault and then we'll perhaps do something with it, or maybe not in a lot of cases. So it needs to be meaningfully in practice and in society's awareness, rather than just something that we go, woohoo, we've got human rights. Because anybody going through any human rights processes in legal systems and at the European courts, it isn't easy, and it's like any process. You don't feel like human rights are being acknowledged as being breached, and you're forever needing to evidence it. So yeah, we need it more meaningfully. I hope that was a succinct enough response to that question.
Thanks a lot responding this important question, like promoting human rights, responsible society structure. It's important to have legislatures, I mentioned, and also like ratifications of those legislatures, legislative backups and mechanisms are very, very important. That's what I figure out. Thanks a lot giving your feedbacks and giving your precious time on the screen for on the screen of RISO, and you've talked about voice program, which you've been sort of addressing human rights, human trafficking, and gender violence, and you've also talked given understanding human domestic violence, and is it limited to a particular gender? Just wrapping it up, identifications current, like how effectively there can be a prevention of domestic violence. You've also explained the diversity and discrimination patterns, context of human rights, and finally talked about the society, how it can be a compatible society, proactive society in order to sort of promote human rights. So thanks a lot giving your precious time, ma'am, and joining us from United Kingdom, England. And as you know, you're already familiar that RISO is a platform where we just try to, our intention is to make a database in particular for research and academics journal where it's not just primarily designed for academicians and researchers, it's also for lay people, so that it's a database availability where people can have access in terms of making our societies much better, much smarter, and much healthier for every gender. Making a scientific database is the very purpose of research. Thanks a lot for joining us on this platform and sharing the screen with us, ma'am.